Hi, and welcome to a review of the Elektron Digitone, along with an overview of FM synthesis, which is at the core of how it works. Last week I posted a video with samples of the factory patterns, and if you check out the comments section, you'll see people are pretty excited about its sound. In this video we'll do a deep dive into the various sound design features of the Digitone. But first, I want to start with a question I got asked most frequently. Are the drum sounds really coming from Digitone? And the answer is, of course, yes. Those weren't samples, but rather well-crafted FM sounds combined with Elektron's well-known sequencing capabilities that allow sound swapping on the fly and great sounding effects. So even though this synth only has 8 voices, it sounds like it has much more. Check out the voice usage information here. You can see that at any given time we're using only 2, 3, maybe 4 of the 8 voices, and yet creating such a complex pattern. Okay, so let's get a basic understanding of FM synthesis and how it's implemented on Digitone. Most other synthesizers use a method called subtractive synthesis. The idea here is that you start with a harmonically rich sound. Check out how this sound has a lot of harmonics on the spectrum analyzer. And then you take a filter and start filtering parts of those harmonics out, adding resonance, and then later on effects, envelopes, and so on. FM synths, on the other hand, in their most basic implementation, start with a single sine wave oscillator, also called a carrier, which has no harmonics. Hence, if you filter it, you won't get any change in timbre, you'll just get a change in volume. Filtering takes out harmonics, and here there aren't any harmonics to take away. Now, the Digitone has 4 such sine oscillators. The main one is called C, and then there are 3 others called A, and then B1 and B2. What happens in FM synthesis is that one or more of these oscillators are used not just to make sounds, but also to rapidly move the frequency of another oscillator. Let's take a look at an example. Look at this diagram here. Ignore the 2 B's for a second. You can see how oscillator A isn't being output to either X or Y, these are the 2 outputs, but rather is connected to oscillator C. What it means is that in this layout or algorithm, A has the option to modulate the frequency of oscillator C. Now let's check out what this sounds like. So this is our plain oscillator C. Now let's hear what happens when oscillator A starts to modulate its frequency very quickly. You can both hear and see how the character, timbre, and harmonics of this waveform changes. Now, FM synthesis is potentially hard and complex because you have to maintain a certain mathematical ratio between the carrier and the modulator, otherwise things can get out of control very quickly. Now, Digitone hides all this complexity from you by maintaining these ratios for you on this synth page. So you can see how you can determine the ratio between oscillator A or modulator A and the frequency of C, and you can do the same thing for B1 and B2 as we later introduce them. So let's listen and look at how changing these ratios affects the sound. So those are the bare basics of FM synthesis. Now, things get much more interesting if you change the rates of modulation over time, and that's what envelopes are for. The Digitone supports pretty complex envelope shapes. You can have 3, 4, or 5 different steps in each envelope. The most simple one is an attack, decay, and end envelope. The idea here is to make your sound more interesting over time as your notes play out. You can postpone the decay level by adding a sustain step to the envelope waveform. And we'll hear this once we add a release to the tone. And you can add a delay stage, which means it can take a while before the envelope starts. So those are 3, 4, and 5-step envelopes supported on the Digitone, and a modulator and an envelope together are called an operator in FM synthesis. Now, there are FM synths that settle for 2 operators. The Digitone is a 4-operator synth, which means we can bring in B1 and B2 to either generate their own sounds or to modulate each other or the other oscillators. So you can see how by combining all these things, sounds can get extremely interesting. So you may have heard the term algorithm. An algorithm is an arrangement of oscillators and how they affect each other's, which ones are modulators and which ones are oscillators that we hear. So for example, in this algorithm, operator A is affecting the frequency of operator C, and C is being output for us to hear it. And then B2 in this case, is both modulating operator C, or carrier in this case C, and also being output. And then B1 is modulating B2. The Digitone supports 8 different algorithms. So as we flip through them, sounds will either sound differently or not, depending on levels and envelopes and how we are combining the different ratios. So it's the combination of these algorithms and ratios, obviously, that keep things very interesting. Now, occasionally you'll see this little feedback loop indicator here, for example, on operator A. This is basically a setting that lets you feedback an operator on itself, and it changes the way that it modulates a carrier. Let's take a listen. Let me turn it up. A feedbacking operator will take a sine wave from a saw all the way to noise. Great for percussive sounds. A nice Digitone feature is detune. And Elektron have also thrown in an additive synthesis feature. The harm or harmonics lets you add additional partials either to A or B or to C. Many times, algorithms will let you hear more than one oscillator or carrier through one of the either X or Y outputs, and you can control the mix between the two. Okay, so the core tone generation in Digitone happens basically in these 2 tabs. There's one page here and 2 pages here. This controls the envelopes, and this controls the core FM synthesis. Now, I'm going to use a noise generator to demonstrate the filters because that's the easiest way to see what's going on. There are 3 filters in the Digitone: a 12 dB per octave low-pass filter with resonance, which is an emphasis at the cutoff point. 12 dB per octave high-pass filter with or without resonance. And a 24 dB per octave, which is a sharper slope low-pass filter. Beside that, you have a filter envelope, which lets you control the motion of the filter as you press a note. This filter envelope basically modulates the cutoff point of any of the filters in this multi-mode filter. and it's bipolar. In addition to this filter, the second page has what Elektron is calling a bass filter, which is basically a combination of a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter. And they're interchangeable and basically can also turn into a bandpass filter. So those are the filtering options. And the amp page lets us control a few things. The first is the overall volume envelope, or amp envelope of our sound. Give it a long attack, or a long release, and of course decay and sustain levels as well as track overdrive and panning. Page number 2 on the amp tab lets us control our effect sends. It'll be a bit easier to hear the effects if I shorten my release a bit. Now, each of the tracks has effects sends. If you want to control the actual effects themselves, you can do that with Shift or Function and the effect name. Infinite reverb is available. Can't have enough of that. Let's check out the parameter effects for the other effects. Let's have a look at delay. I'll just play with this a bit. You can set the delay timing, and it's synced to your tempo. I think the effects are a big factor in why the Digitone sounds so good. Let me just remove the reverb and delay. Let's hear the chorus. And with a shift function, you can edit the chorus parameters as well. Next up, we have two LFOs. The LFOs can control any number of destinations, and what's really nice about how this works is that you get a preview of the effect of the LFO as you scroll through the destination list. Once you pick an LFO destination, you can control the LFO speed and shape. And there's a second LFO page to handle additional parameters, like fading the LFO in or out, speed multiples, and there are a few LFO modes. You can even make the LFO run just once if you want it to behave like an envelope. So these 5 buttons are the core sound design options. There's one more in here, which is another overdrive, a master overdrive. The rest of the controls in the master section, we'll talk about them later when I speak about MIDI sequencing, because they're used to apply effects to audio coming from the inputs. Great, so now that we know how to make sounds and what is at the core of the Digitone engine, let's talk about creating music. We can play live with the onboard keyboard or plug in an external MIDI keyboard. You have 4 basic tracks for sequencing music, and you can sequence up to 8 notes on each. There are over 500 preset sounds built in, so there's a lot for you to explore. To pick a new sound, just double tap a key and start auditioning the different sounds. My dog approves of that one. Now, these are a lot of sounds to go through. So you can apply filters if you like. Let's see, I want to look for a bass sound. And now this list will just include sounds that are tagged as bass. Okay, once I'm ready to sequence a track, I can choose its length. I get up to 64 steps per pattern, and you can chain patterns if you like. You set pattern lengths pretty easily through here. Let's take a 32-step pattern. I can turn on a metronome, and there are two ways to record, unquantized or quantized. So if you have steps that are off the quantized timing or want your mistakes played back to you, unquantized is the way to go. You can also step sequence. There are two alternative modes to enter steps in a sequence. One is using this little mini keyboard on top of the display. And there's another way. Let me choose a different sound using the track note function. And this little page lets you play different kinds of chords. Set your scales. And I think you get the idea. Now, you can play these chords live or record them using the step sequencer. Now, I think it's better just to maybe connect a keyboard than to sequence like this, but if you want a step sequence, then this is definitely workable. You just pick the step and then hit it in combination with a track note button. Choose your chord. Hit yes, and it's sequenced. Okay, so let's talk about what Elektron sequencers are renowned for, which is parameter locking. So the idea here is that any parameter on any page can be changed on a per step basis. So let's do this, for example, for reverb. So I just activated reverb just on this one particular step in the sequence. Another unique Elektron feature is trig conditions. So the idea here is to take a step, let's take this chord for example, and have it trigger conditionally. So not every sequence, but maybe every other sequence or every 4 or 5 sequences. Let me choose, in this case, a 33% chance of this chord triggering. So, okay, we got lucky again, but okay, see, it's not triggering, and yep, here we go. So trig conditions are a great way to add variety to your patterns. Finally, sound blocks is another Elektron feature which I think is totally nuts, which is the ability to change sounds individually in a pattern to something completely different. So here I'm adding a kick, and I can add a snare. And I just added that to the same track that's playing my chords. And I think you can start to imagine the amount of variety you can add into just one simple single track. And not only does it do beats, it also does drummers that can't stay on one. So for every step, you have control over micro timing. And the purpose, of course, is not to imitate bad drummers, but rather to give your track natural timing. Before the grand finale, and there is one, I want to very quickly go through a few noteworthy features. There's swing control. You've got various settings for management of voice stealing. there are various unison settings so that you can have a nice unison spread sound. And I overdid it a bit here with my unison requirements. Obviously that's going to take up a lot of voices, but it's a nice sound. Beside that, in the voice menu, you can also layer sounds. So you can pick whichever two sounds you want and play them together. You've got a really sophisticated arpeggiator, which does all the standard things an arpeggiator does. But beside that, also has this sequencing mode, same as on the Analog 4. And you can do some pretty original things with this. Basically every dot is an offset in the arpeggiator pattern. I think that's an amazing creative tool. Beside that, you can also use the track note function, remember the one with the chords, and apply an arpeggiator to that as well. And what this does is effectively let you play an arpeggiated chord with just one finger. Take that, music theory lessons. And you can record this into a sequence if you want. The last important Digitone feature I want to cover is its 4-track MIDI sequencer in combination with the ability to apply effects to incoming external audio. Here, I'm both sequencing and controlling the filter of the Moog Mother 32 behind the Digitone. And then applying effects to it. Now, I'm going to make a whole video about this, so hit subscribe. And since this is an FM synth, ring the bell to be notified when that video comes out. Or if you're from the future, just check the channel. Hit like if you learned something. Thanks for watching.